Hello golden jobbergs, welcome once again to my channel. This is Sir Job and welcome to Sir Job TV. So for those who are new sa aking YouTube channel, please don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell for you to be updated with my upcoming videos. So I already discussed to you the concept of ethnocentrism, the concept of cultural relativism under the different viewpoints and perspectives of culture. So for this morning, I just want to discuss to you the concept of culture shock and the concept of third culture shock. This is my video number 29. So when we speak of culture shock, the definition, the general definition that is being accepted is that it refers to the feeling of disbelief, disorganization, and frustration one experiences when he encounters cultural pattern or practices which is different from his. So in the definition, highlight natin ang mga concept ng disbelief, disorganization, and frustration. Meaning to say, upon entering a certain place, it is normal for people to feel culture shock. Meaning to say, naninibago ka sa isang situation or naninibago ka sa isang lugar. It is because of this particular feeling na nararamdaman mo sa iyong sarili. The concept of disbelief, kasi they have their culture na hindi mo pinaniniwalaan or outside from what you believe. What is right and wrong. For example, that is when nagkakaroon tayo ng culture shock within ourselves upon entering a certain place. That is basically the motion. Okay, this organization, because it is not pattern with what you believe. Again, as I said to you, bago siya, it's a new thing sa yung perspective as a person or what kind of culture na meron ka prior to your visit on that particular place. That is basically the concept. So, and frustration. So, because merong disbelief, merong disorganization on that kind of practices sa yung sarili or sa yung system. So, at the end of the day, as a result, nagkakaroon ka ng frustration within yourselves. Correct? And that is normal. Basically, when we are talking about culture shock, this is a normal feeling or this is a normal emotion for one person. But later on, you will see the beauty of culture shock and how Filipinos adjusting themselves in this particular concept in the very first place. So let us continue in defining this particular concept. So again, meron kang disbelief, disorganization, and frustration because it is outside from the cultural patterns and practices that you have been into for a couple of years, for example. So that's basically the triggering factor why. But the basic question that we have to raise at this very point is, bakit tayo nagkakaroon ng culture shock within ourselves? Bakit it is normal for people to feel culture shock whenever he visited or he traveled or he encountered different culture outside from what he believed? Bakit? Okay, because he becomes so accustomed. The concept is he becomes so accustomed to his cultural milieu. So when we speak of cultural milieu, it is actually the cultural setting or the cultural environment na kung saan ka lumaki in the very first place. Like for example, you're living here for 30 years or for 20 years. In that span of time, okay, you are believing that this is the only world, no, nakikita mo kasi hindi ka open-minded for all the cultures from the rest of the world. Kaya nga in this generation, I should have to say, very we are very lucky enough in this generation because by just simply clicking at the internet, by just simply watching videos in the YouTube, you could be able to encounter different cultures from the rest of the world. Unlike before, wala pang internet connection, wala pang ganitong modernization sa ating mundo. So, they only limited for the kind of culture that they are living for the rest of their lives. So, that is why culture shock before, as how they perceive, is different from the culture shock as how we perceive today. Because basically, iba na po ang environment natin. Noon kasi wala pang ganong modernization, as I said to you. So, basically, ang mundo ng mga tao, or the thinking or the concept of one person who is living in that particular place is loyal only to the kind of culture na kung saan siya lumaki. But in today's time, no. Kasi meron ng internet connection, or we could be able to see, as I said to you a while ago, we could be able to see different cultures from the rest of the world by just watching different videos in the YouTube channel, in the YouTube, or in different social media platforms at the end of the day. So in this generation, as I said, iba na po ang perspective ng culture shock. But still, nag-i-exist pa rin po ang concept ng culture shock even at this very point of generation. Let us continue. Cultural milieu. What is cultural milieu again? Cultural milieu is the cultural setting kung saan ka lumaki. Take note of that. Cultural milieu that he finds himself disgusted, unsettled, troubled, and disoriented. So focus na naman tayo sa mga words na ito, that he finds himself disgusted, unsettled, troubled, and disoriented when he enters another society with a different culture. So I already explained to you sa previous portion or sa previous part of this definition of the concept of culture shock. So definitely ganun pa rin ang konsepto. Kung meron tayong disbelief, disorganization, and frustration, here na portion, meron tayong disgusted, unsettled, troubled, and disoriented. But the concept is the same. The goal is the same, or the application is the same. As I said to you, when he enters another society with a different culture. So ganun ang usual nating nafe-feel. Even until today, kahit gaano ka katalino, kahit gaano ka ka-expose, kaya nga sinasabi ko, normal po ang culture shock. But the thing is, kailangan i-adjust natin ang sarili natin. The way how we adjust ourselves. But the most important thing is, kung na-learn mo ang cultural relativism, if you apply cultural relativism, mas madaling mag-adjust ang sarili mo. But when you apply ethnocentrism, mas mahihirapan kang mag-apply in adjusting yourself in conquering culture shock in the very first place. So that's basically one thing that you have to consider in traveling, for example, or in visiting other places or visiting other community. You always have to open your mind that they have different cultures from yours, and that is basically the base, that is our point of view in adjusting ourselves as to how we surmount the concept of culture shock in the very first place. So now let's proceed to some of the examples. Okay, example number 1, when typical religious person enters a nudist camp, he may experience shock and show disbelief. Correct? This is normal. This is usually happening in the society. Like basically, when you are a religious person, so you always have to say, "Na I don't want to ruin my mind. I want to destroy my thinking because of this situation." So there is a culture shock because you've never been into that situation before. Kasi ang buhay mo nasa traditional world. What is the teaching of the Bible, the Holy Scripture, for example, because you are so indulged with that kind of thing, and then here comes one day or one situation, you are being exposed to a society wherein liberated, full of freedom, something like that. So you always have to, or it is expected for you to feel culture shock out from that. Okay, so another thing is in terms of communication problems such as not being understood. This is about the language. Okay, as you travel different places, nagkakaroon ka ng difficulty in understanding people. So that's basically one thing na makukulture shock ka with how they speak, how fast they speak. Kasi may mga group of people kasi na mabilis magsalita, meron ding napakahina, merong napakaslang. So that is part of your struggle in visiting other places from the rest of the world. So that's how you need to conquer. But that's one thing, or that's attachment to the concept of culture shock in the very first place. Another thing is the unusual foods. This is common. Diba, unusual foods, when you offered, like for example, nag-visit ka sa yung friend, a Muslim friend for example, and then he offered you foods na talagang napaka-spicy, ganito ang kanilang taste, 'di ba? So it's difficult for you to adjust, but hopefully you could be able to adjust. Just give respect for a little on that particular situation. That's very important, no? Mahirap talaga, but that's part. Sa food, sa communication, meron talagang culture shock na may experience ang isang social actor upon traveling. So let's continue. Differing attitude is also considered. Differing attitudes and customs So these things may start to irritate you. Okay, again, as not being understood when it comes to language, unusual foods, differing attitudes, kasi ang culture, it attaches to our behavior and how we react, our characteristics, right? It is attaches to that particular thing. So pag sinabi nating culture, it usually connects to the concept of behavior. So because culture is diverse, nagbavary from places to places, therefore, behavior varies also from different people. Again, behavior is attaches to our culture, what kind of culture we are in. So, and customs, any other practices and traditions that we are following as part of our daily routine. These things may start to irritate you. So that is the concept of culture shock. These are the things that will make you frustrated, that will make you disappointed, that will make you irritated. But the bottom line of my discussion is, you have to understand the concept of culture shock in the very first place. Kasi ang goal natin dito as a social actor is how we are going to control ourselves, or how we are going to adjust ourselves from this particular struggle, because definitely mahirap ito. So the concept is, you have to adjust and to adjust. But before you have to adjust, you need to learn the concept of cultural relativism in the very first place. That is very important. Cultural relativism, you connect that one to the concept of culture shock, and you will have to deal the interaction perfectly as wherever you want to go in the world. That's the concept. So another thing for this morning is we have to discuss also the concept of third culture shock. So we have culture shock, and we also have the concept of third culture shock. What is the difference between these two concepts? So let's go directly to the definition given when we speak of culture shock. Accordingly, culture shock is a good example of enculturation. Is a good example of enculturation. I already discussed to you what is enculturation all about sa aking previous video. It is the it is the gradual acquisition of characteristics, or it is the gradual acquisition of a culture or a certain culture that is enculturation in the first place. So this is how it is connected to the concept of third culture shock. We are now discussing the third culture shock. Individuals who have stayed for a quite good portion of their lives, especially the period of the formative years. Okay, highlight natin tong naka-open close parenthesis. Especially the period after the formative years. So when we are speaking formative years, it actually focuses on the years of a certain individual from 0 to 8 years old. Pag sinabi kong formative years, na-cover niya ang period ng 0 to 8 years old ng isang existence. So that is very critical, kasi kung ano yung na-introduce sa mga periods na yan, yan yung maglalast sa isang existence. Meaning to say, yan ang always kong mariremember, at yan ang madidevelop sa akin kung ano yung na-introduce sa akin sa formative years. Kaya sinabi dito, especially the period after the formative years in a foreign culture may be shocked by their birth culture once exposed to it again. Like for example, isa kang Filipino, okay? But during sa formative years mo, ipinanganak ka for example dito sa Philippines, pero at the age of 2 to 5 years old, for example, or 7 years old, or mas higher pa dyan, okay, na years, doon ka na talaga tumira sa United States of America, for example, okay? So meaning to say, ipinanganak ka sa Philippines, your nationality is Filipino, both of your parents were Filipinos, in that particular example that I'm giving to you, pero tumira ka sa America for the rest of your lives, like for example, from 3 years old up to 20 years old, for example, okay, or higher than that. So, pag bumalik ka sa Pilipinas ngayon, okay, pag bumalik ka sa Pilipinas after, for example, 15 years or 20 years, maninibago ka sa kultura na kung saan talaga originally yan ang naging kultura mo. Yun ang ibig sabihin ng third culture shock. Kaya nga sinasabi dito, after the formative years in a foreign culture may be shocked by their birth culture. Birth culture, I'm talking kung saan ka ipinanganak, kung ano talaga ang nationality mo in the very first place. Kasi may mga ganong situation na if you are a Filipino, your parents were both Filipinos, pero pinalaki ka nila in America, for example. I don't know what's the purpose, but may mga chances kasi na ganun po ang nangyayari sa isang existence ng isang Filipino citizen. So this is how we are going to understand third culture shock in the very first place. The shock created by their birth culture is a product of their inculturation in the second culture. Highlight natin ito ha. The shock created by their birth culture, ito yung sinasabi kong Filipino culture, okay, is a product of their inculturation. Going back to our definition, inculturation is the gradual acquisition of a certain characteristic or culture in the second culture. Mas na-exposed or mas na-engross ka with the second culture kasi matagal ang exposure mo and your formative years was actually being crafted doon mismo sa second culture. Kaya kapag bumalik ka ngayon sa birth culture mo or the original culture that you have, magkakaroon ka ng third culture shock. Nagets niyo po ang point ng third culture shock. I hope that you could be able to grasp already at this very moment what's the difference between culture shock and third culture shock in the very first place. Now, to give you more understanding, let's dissect further what is really the definition of this particular concept. So when we speak of culture shock, is the mixed identity that a child assumes, influenced both by their parents' culture and the culture in which they are raised. So it's a mixed identity, okay? Dito naka-highlight from the parents' culture, like for example, Filipino culture, from the parents' culture and from the culture which they are raised. Like for example, you are a Filipino, but you are being raised in America, so it's a mixed culture. That is what we call third culture. Okay? Third culture. But in the application, again, yung ginawa kong example kanina, pag na-apply siya, yung third culture na yan, magiging third culture shock. So now, I'll give you one example for you to understand further anong ibig sabihin ng third culture shock. So, in here, meron tayong example na Gina forgot how to eat balot after living in America for 15 years. So, nakalimutan na ni Gina kung ano yung papaano kumain ng balot or siguro ma-appreciate ang taste ng balot after living in America for 15 years. Maybe wala siyang experience or wala talagang balot in America, for example. So, ganun ang tendency. Okay? Nakakalimutan natin. But it doesn't mean na hindi na tayo makaka-adjust also with our original culture because that is basically our birth culture. So, it's easy for us to adapt naman the situation. Pero, may mga tendency talaga na nakakalimutan natin how to perform this particular culture or some of the tendencies papaano ito i-appreciate kasi minsan nakakalimutan talaga natin how to appreciate the beauty of our birth culture because we are being exposed to the second culture kung saan tayo ipinalaki for that particular situation. So recapitulate lang tayo for a moment for us to understand. Pag sinabi kong culture shock, it is the act of a person na nandito ako lumaki na kultura, lumipat ako sa isang culture or nakapunta ako ng ibang culture, that is culture shock. Pero pag sinabi kong dito ako lumaki na kultura pero sa formative years ko and beyond that, nakatira ako sa ibang culture and then after a couple of years, bumalik ako sa aking birth culture, nagkakaroon ako ng third culture shock. So I hope that you already got the point. Ano ang ibig sabihin ng culture shock and third culture shock in the very first place. So that would be all for this morning. I hope that you learned something from this video and I hope that you will share this video to your friends and to anybody else that you think nangangailangan ng video na ito. Asahan niyo po that Sir Job TV will continue to give you meaningful discussion, especially in the field of social sciences. Good morning once again, Golden Jobbergs. Bye-bye!